He's about 455 yards away. He's going to hit about a 2-iron, I think.
This is the School of Motion podcast. Come for the MoGraph, stay for the puns. Imagine that you're a creative director at a big studio. You've got access to the best gear, the best talent, clients with large budgets. Sounds pretty darn good, doesn't it? Now, what do you think your day looks like? Is it all brainstorming sessions and work critiques and high fives and beautiful renders out of the render farm and beers? Or maybe it's a little bit more than that. Maybe there's even some not so fun parts about being a creative director. And for that matter, how the hell do you get to be a creative director? Well, to answer all of those questions, we have brought Ryan Summers onto our podcast. Ryan is an incredibly talented and experienced motion designer who has worked with shops like Imaginary Forces, Royale, Oddfellows, and who now holds the title of creative director at the legendary Digital Kitchen in Chicago. I throw tons of questions at Ryan about why he made the transition from freelance back to full-time, why he moved from LA to Chicago, and then, of course, what the heck does a creative director do all day? Ryan is basically an encyclopedia of MoGraph, so this conversation is a really fascinating look at what the top of the food chain looks like in our industry. Ryan is working at a killer shop with killer clients on killer projects, so let's dive in and find out how you get that gig and what it's really like once you're there. But first, a very quick word from one of our incredible alumni.
My name is Lucas. I'm from Chicago, and I took animation boot camp. Motion design is a relatively young industry. I didn't study it in school, and there are not many good resources that I knew about. In the first couple of weeks of animation boot camp, I learned so many of the basics that I had just missed. It's immediately made me become better at the work I do every day. The community that is cultivated by School of Motion is the most valuable part of the class. I've met so many people who I can get feedback from, collaborate with on projects, ask questions to, or just hang out with. I'd recommend animation boot camp to anyone who wants to learn how to improve their craft. My name is Lucas Langworthy, and I'm a School of Motion graduate.
Ryan, dude, thank you so much. I feel like it's about damn time you came on this podcast, so I'm really happy you're here, man.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. I love the show. I love the boot camps. And after I heard that you had Radkey on, I had to try to find a way to get on myself.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he spoke highly of you, so you must have some dirt on him or something.
I pay him very well.
Yeah, that's good. He's on the payroll, the Ryan Summers payroll. So first of all, I know a lot of our listeners are probably familiar with you because you are one of the most active people on Twitter I've ever met. You also teach for MoGraph Mentor. Your work's amazing. You've been interviewed on other podcasts. So some people know about you. But for those that don't, could you give us like the brief version of the Ryan Summers story so we can find out how you ended up as a creative director at Digital Frickin' Kitchen?
Yeah, well, the first thing to know about me is I'm a big fucking nerd, number one. And I didn't know that for a long time and really realized it when I got into this industry. But the short story is before I ever got into animation, motion graphics, I was actually a chemical engineering student. So I was a man of science and kind of like behind the scenes, always loved everything to do with art. I always drew, played video games like crazy, loved movies, loved animation, but didn't realize that was actually like a real career path. And I'm old, so I'll date myself, but I was in high school when like Jurassic Park, Toy Story, and Night Before Christmas all kind of came out around the same time. And while I was going to school for chemical engineering, I happened to take just like an animation class in like 3D Studio. It wasn't even 3D Studio Max. It was DOS. It wasn't even running on Windows, if anybody even remembers what DOS is.
DOS, wow.
But I took that and it was, I've said it a couple times before, but it's the first time, I used to think these words were awful, but it's the first time I ever felt flow, like just sitting down and all of a sudden 10 hours go by and it was daytime and now it's nighttime. And after about 2 or 3 classes of like learning 3D and starting to actually make like a box of Pop-Tarts animate, I knew it was something I had to do. So I kind of dropped everything I was doing and became an artist and dedicated kind of like my whole life to doing that. So I more than anything, I'm an animator. I love animation. I went to school for character animation. Actually, my first couple jobs were just doing character stuff. And then I've had like every job you could have up until like the last 5 years leading up into motion graphics. When I moved to LA from Chicago, I started working at Imaginary Forces, and then it's like I only went to school for 2 years for animation, but IF was like the rest of my education all in a box, all in one place, all at once. And then I've kind of just gone from there. I've been freelance, I've been staff, I've been working remotely, I've worked in offices, kind of all over the place since then.
I had no idea that you were studying chemical science in college. I mean, that's really crazy to me. And I want to ask you about that because one of the things that struck me, especially because you mentioned character animation, is how technical animation is when you really get into it, especially if you're doing hand-drawn. There is a lot of science to it. I'm curious if that was initially what attracted you. Because, for example, for me, the thing that sucked me into the field was how cool this software is, and you can do all this stuff with it. And the art part, the creative, design, and actually the art of animation, that came later. Did it work that way for you? Were you sucked in by the geeky stuff first?
I think it was actually the opposite. It was weird. So being in science, going to school for chemical engineering, so much was math and formula and a lot of studying, a lot of memorization, a lot of like that one part of your brain. And I felt like when I was in school, I was desperate for writing classes and drawing classes. And I've always loved animation and film and comic books and video games. And while I was doing the thing that I thought was what I was supposed to be doing, in air quotes, like finding my career and finding a job, all of my free time was going to all these other things that were all more organic, that were more hand skills, that were more like firing off that other side of your brain. That's a different kind of analysis. So I feel like it was me just like screaming out, like, this is not what I want to do, but it's the safe thing to do. And then there's just this moment where like a career path kind of opened up. But I do think it helps me quite a bit having kind of a science background. I think the two things that really came out of, like 2.5 to 3 years of intense kind of like science background was the power of observation, like the way you have to study and the way you have to observe and build your kind of hypothesis brain from science. And then the other big thing, and hopefully maybe we talk about this a little bit, I think it's actually helped a lot of my creative directing, where I'm interacting with clients and interacting with students or interacting with other animators, is being able to eliminate as many variables and find the one thing that makes the difference in that specific moment when you're analyzing something. That is a big part of what I was learning and being trained as a scientist, was to focus in on single variables and find like a constant that's true that everything else can kind of work off of. And I think that's what we do a lot, especially in creative direction, especially in teaching, which I've gotten a chance to do a lot of, is we have so many tools, we have so many options, we have so many techniques. We're inundated with inspiration, and the cool thing Ash Thorpe just did, and the other thing that was just in a movie, and this other commercial, and this movie title, that like we have to kind of still filter all that noise out and get to the like one constant and then work back up from that. And it took me a long time to kind of realize that that's what science gave me. Like that's what studying to be an engineer gave me, because I kind of was like, all right, I'm an artist. I'm going to run as far away as possible from all this other stuff. But it's only in the last 3 or 4 years where I've really done a lot of creative directing that I can see where it affected my personality and where it actually comes in handy now.
Okay, we'll definitely come back to this, because I think that makes a lot of sense. A lot of your job as creative director is to focus your team on the important things and to ignore all the extra stuff that might be distractions. And that I've never thought of it that way. I mean, that is sort of science. It's just learning to like remove variables one at a time until you find the thing that's actually important. So let's talk about how you got to your current position. So, I'm looking at your LinkedIn page. You've worked a lot of places. You've had a lot of titles. You worked at Imaginary Forces, and then you were freelance for a while. And that's kind of when you came on my radar, was in your freelance days, and you were working with a lot of cool studios. You're freelancing in LA. Can you talk about how you got into freelancing? Like, what did it take for you to become a quote successful freelancer in Los Angeles? The #1 MoGraph market.
I think a lot of it just turned into reputation. And it's funny, you mentioned Twitter. When I teach now, I teach a lot of different things. At MoGraph Mentor, we teach a lot about design-based thinking and design-based animation. But the other component that I try to, at least on my side for my classes, is teach networking. And when I moved from Chicago and moved to LA, I didn't know anyone. And about a year before I did, Twitter was just starting to become a thing in our industry. Before that, everybody kind of hung out on mograph.net, and that was awesome. And it had its own kind of personality. But Twitter changed everything. And I was actually able to meet a lot of people that a year or two later, after having pretty intense conversations or studying together or coming up with like ways to kind of solve problems. When I went to LA, I actually knew more people than I thought I did. And that actually doubled back when I left Imaginary Forces to go freelance. That kind of reputation of being somebody who shares and somebody who has lots of inspiration that they're kind of throwing out there, and kind of also problem solving, really helped me go from just having a pretty cool demo reel that people didn't know exactly what I may have done or accomplished at Imaginary Forces, because it's such a big team, it's such a big group of people on every project, that people, I kind of had the bona fides of the projects and being at IF, but then I think I also had a personal reputation with a lot of people that I could walk into a place like Royale and I knew 4 or 5 people that I never met in real life, but talked to probably on an almost daily basis, as if we were sitting next to each other. So for me, that's actually, it was a shock to me when I would walk into shops and kind of already know half the people there already. It kind of proved my theory that networking and hard work are really the only 2 things that matter in this industry. That like, if you bust your ass and you work really hard, that's one thing. But if you don't know anyone, or you've isolated yourself, or you don't have a reputation of somebody that you want to sit down and work next to, it's going to limit what you can do and where you can work.
That's amazing advice. I've heard the same thing from guys like, David Stanfield. He talked to me about the power of Twitter and the power of Dribble and sort of these social networking sites that now that's a legitimate way to get booked. And you're, the wisdom you're spewing about like the power of networking. Networking is really how you get booked. I mean,
yep.
And I'm assuming in LA, you're extremely talented, but there's like 100 people out there or more that are as talented as you, but you were getting booked all the time, I'm assuming. And that might have been the difference. Would you agree?
Absolutely. I mean, just talking about Imaginary Forces, there are, and kind of even timing with what you said about not being on your radar till I went freelance, there are hundreds of people way more talented than me with more experience, better client skills, more refined taste than I have, that are just buried away in studios. At Imaginary Forces, we had, off the top of my head, I can think of 5 or 6 people that no one in your audience has ever heard of that are amazing. And every one of these shops has those people too. But they're not on Twitter, or maybe they're a little older and they don't really think like social media is anything more than selfies and shots of your dinner, at a restaurant. But it really, I would say for me, it really was a differentiator. When I go to NAB or hopefully Blend, I feel like the only way I can walk in is to have a t-shirt with my stupid avatar on it. And if I walked to every person and shook my head and said, "Hi, I'm Ryan Summers. I'm really excited to see you," 1 out of every 10 people might know what that means. But if I walk in and say, "Hi, I'm Otternod," or "Hey, here's my Twitter avatar," I'll get smiling faces and high fives and handshakes, down the line, because we've all been talking for forever. So yeah, I can't stress the importance of it enough, that it really is reputation building.
And for people who haven't seen Ryan's Twitter image, it looks like, it reminds me of like Bam Bam Bigelow's face with like a red wrestling mask over it, making the most ridiculous expression. Yeah. And I mean, Ryan, I'm not sure I've actually seen a photo of you. Like, to me, that's what you look like.
That means I've done my job then.
I'll be disappointed if you don't, if I meet you in person.
I don't want people to know what I look like, but yeah, that guy is, that's Big Van Vader. And it's funny that you mentioned Bam Bam Bigelow, because they were tag team champions in the late 80s and early 90s in All Japan and New Japan Pro Wrestling, which probably 3 people in your audience will know what that means. But he's my all-time favorite pro wrestler. My brother and I were and still now follow professional wrestling. But when I was a little kid, I think I was probably 10. My brother was 6 in Chicago. We went to our first show, and this guy was in like the semi-main event, and he's like the big bad guy. He's a villain. He's this huge dude. He was fighting the face, the fan favorite. And my brother and I, literally, these little kids stood on top of our chairs and we're cheering and screaming our heads off for this guy while everybody else was booing. And he ran to the corner, jumped out of the ring, ran to the metal kind of the barricades, and was just yelling at us, like going crazy. But he was smiling the whole time, like he was supposed to be in character. But he loved that these 2 little kids were going bonkers. And every time we ever went to a show after that, the guy, I think, recognized us. So he made a really big impression on me, but he was also mega talented. So we could talk about wrestling for forever. But yeah,
I was going to say
dude,
that'll be the wrestling podcast that we start after this, right?
But that dude embodies everything that I like I hope to be. Like he was mega talented. He's He's got incredible energy. If you ever met him in real life, you'd want to like spend time with him. He's got great stories. Like he's awesome. So I had to change my name. I couldn't use my name for like my website or anything because there's like 20 Ryan Summers and they all are bald and they're all white dudes. So I had to kind of brand myself a long time ago. So I made up this made up word and then stuck his face on it. And it's done well for me for as long as I've been on Twitter.
That's great. Well, first of all, I want to say there's nothing wrong with being a bald white dude. You know, I feel you there, man. And so you mentioned this, you know, and the way you put it, it created this funny mental image in my head. I think you said that there's amazing artists kind of squirreled away in the recesses of places like Imaginary Forces. And I know that that's not how everybody feels being on staff, right? I mean, there are people that are incredibly happy on staff. I'm sure at Imaginary Forces, it's got to be an amazing place to work. However, you know, I tell everybody that will listen to me that I think freelancing is a really great tool for certain times in your career. And it's something that I wish every motion designer had some experience with. So what was it that made you want to leave IF to go freelance?
When I joined IF, and when I went to LA, I had three shops I always wanted to work at. One was Imaginary Forces, one was Blur, and one was DreamWorks. And I had been at Imaginary Forces, I think, for about a year and a half freelance. And then I went staff, and I think I was there for like another 2-ish years. And by the time I was done, I had gone from literally a guy working on a laptop in the kitchen, just doing, I think my first job was the Chinese Mandarin version of High School Musical 2's teaser trailer. Like literally throw away, we got to get this done, just give it to the lowest guy on the totem pole, to creative directing jobs at IF and working with Max on directly. Like in like 3.5 to 4 years, I kind of did everything that I felt I could do at Imaginary Forces. And I learned so much from some of the heavyweights there, the Michelle Doherty's, Karen Fong, Grant Lau, Charles, all their like heavyweight guys. I had kind of hit my glass ceiling at that office. And I had taken everything I could. And I was kind of getting to the point where it's like, I've seen how one company handles every kind of job multiple times. And I really knew that there were other ways, there had to be other ways to kind of pitch jobs, bid jobs, plan for them, hire people, execute them, work on different kinds of, you know, render farms. And I was really just itching to take these kind of hypotheses that I had that I couldn't really test out any further. And I wanted to go to other shops. I wanted to try to work. When I moved to LA from Chicago, my goal the whole time was to just work with the best people I could. And at IF, I got a chance to be an understudy to all of the great people that were there. I got a chance to lead and work alongside with a lot of those great people. And I kind of was at the point where I'm like, man, I got to see how somebody like Blur does their jobs, because they make crazy stuff. And the other big reason, honestly, was I love character animation and I really wanted to start doing more. And at the time at Imaginary Forces, we really weren't going after that kind of work at all. So it was really just a mutual, like, thank you very much. I hope I can freelance later in the future for you guys, and best wishes. And, you know, like, again, there are handshakes and high fives when I left. And then I just started freelancing at as many different places as I could.
And what's it like freelancing in LA after, you know, coming from a place like IF? Was it pretty easy to get work? You're booked all the time?
Yeah, it was awesome. It was one of those kind of little honeymoon moments where if you've ever worked at a big place for a while and worked on a couple jobs that people actually remember, you can kind of go around town and just do some interviews, kind of just like see what's out there and see the landscape. And I did that. I went to Elastic, I went to Blur, I went to Troika, a bunch of different shops just to see what kind of work they were doing and what kind of spots they needed to kind of fill. And that's exciting. That's great, because when you are staff, there's that amazing sense of like security and camaraderie with people. You have this kind of extended relationship and extended dialogue with all your coworkers. But at a certain point, you are kind of just a slave to whatever the cadence is of the work that's coming in. Like all of a sudden we're doing a lot of Reese's Pieces commercials, or we're doing one kind of work gets really, really popular or gets accolades, and then you get stuck kind of doing that same kind of work over and over, which is for the company is great. But when you're at the point where like, man, I really want to do some, you know, 2D character animation, and I want to try messing with Toon Boom and Moho, and you find yourself doing all that work at home because none of that work is actually at work when you're getting paid to do it. It definitely kind of puts a grind on you if you have ambitions to try different stuff. So it's great, man. When you can go out into town and then you can kind of cast the job you want based on the company that, you know, the companies that are available. That's great. That was an awesome time for me to just feel like, where do I want to go? Like, what kind of environment do I want to be in? What kind of work do I want to kind of like dive into? For me, that was the big allure of freelance.
That's actually what I tell people the point of freelancing is. It's just this tool that lets you kind of escape that situation that you just talked about, where you're on staff and maybe it's great, and maybe all your coworkers are great, maybe they're paying you well, but you don't have a choice as to what you're working on. You're working on what the company needs you to work on. But as a freelancer, you have the flexibility to say yes or no to jobs. And
Exactly.
It's a subtle distinction, but it makes all the difference. Okay, so you're freelancing in LA and you're working with, I mean, you just listed great companies. Like, a lot of people listening would die to work at one of those. You're talking about 5 of them. But now you're back in Chicago and you're on staff at Digital Kitchen. So tell me about that transition. Why did that happen?
It's crazy. When I left Chicago to go to LA, a good friend of mine asked me, like, what would make you come back here? Like, LA's got everything. It's got animation, it's got feature films, it's got, amazing music opportunities, it's got all this culture, it's got all this life. What would get you to come back here? And I literally told him, I was like, if I could come back and be a creative director at Digital Kitchen in like the next 10 years, that's the only way I would come back. And it's funny because about 2 years ago, my buddy Chad Ashley invited me to come up. I was actually interviewing a bunch of studios because I was going to be working at Adobe. I helped Adobe work on After Effects last summer. And I was actually doing tours of studios to find out what their pain points were. Like, how do you guys use After Effects in ways I haven't seen? And what would you guys love to see changed? And I happened to go to talk to Chad, and I sat down at DK, which I hadn't been in the offices for a few years. And at the end of that, Chad asked me if I would come back in and creative direct a job because they had too many jobs going on, and they were doing this National Geographic Explorer opening. And at the same time, my really good friend Mike Radke, that you interviewed, had just moved over here from LA, and I would have had the chance to work with him as an editor. And he's one of my favorite editors to work with. He's awesome, and I would have the chance to kind of work with National Geographic, which one of my favorite companies. It just was this perfect storm. So I actually flew out from LA, organized my booking so that I could take kind of like a month and a half off. And then I was here and directed that opening, and I had a really great time. And then I'm trying to think how long it was. It was like almost like a year later, I got a call from my producer at DK, who had become the EP, and asked me if I was interested in coming over. And I kind of was getting a little homesick, but more than anything, I was really looking for an opportunity to kind of like be a creative director, be in the position where you're kind of like top to bottom working on everything. You're not just jamming on animation. You're not a gun for hire. As fun as that can be, there is a certain part of me that loves being on the team and has these extended relationships, has this ability to kind of go out and get work, has the ability to hire people and train them and grow with them and put them in the right roles. Like there's a bunch of stuff beyond just like jamming on keyframes that over the last 2 or 3 years I've really appreciated, and really, honestly, part of it's just come from teaching so much. I enjoyed that so much that being able to go back to Chicago and integrate that into my like day-to-day life, on top of DK does amazing work and works on different kinds of canvases than I'd been working on. Lots of things to bring me back to Chicago.
Very cool. All right. So it was a little bit of everything. But let me ask you this. Was there some other option where you just remain freelance, but you are sort of a freelance creative director that DK can hire a bunch when they need to, and you could go to Chicago, but then you could come back to LA, and then maybe you go to New York? Was that also something that you could have done? And was there a reason you didn't choose that route?
Yeah, that's one of the cool things about, I think, motion design, the industry in general, is that unlike feature films or animation or TV or working at agencies, it still feels like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the motion graphics industry was like a volcano. Like it completely exploded and it went a bunch of different directions, but it still is kind of like in that cooling stage. Like it still is like it's still kind of like magma. Like every shop works differently. Every job title is different in every shop. Like a creative director at DK is different than a creative director at IF. I had done a little bit of freelance creative directing, but you really are that kind of gun for hire, where you're kind of just called in, you drop in, you do a job, and you walk out. And a lot of times you're still not the true creative director because there'll be someone within that company above you, or there'll be someone in a relationship with the client that you're not really what I think of as like the vision that's leading the job. it's you can find those, but it's a lot harder. And sometimes the work is really specific to like you're a freelance creative director, but you're doing live action and it has a little bit of motion graphics, but it wasn't the kind of work that I was really seeing myself wanting to do more of. So there was the opportunity to do that in other places, not necessarily at Digital Kitchen. They were looking for someone to come in. I mentioned Chad Ashley. Chad had left Digital Kitchen and worked with Grayscale Gorilla, and they were looking for someone to kind of come in and take that position and kind of like move the motion graphics into a different direction. So it was really specific. That's what's great about the industry, is that every like opportunity is specific to the person and to the company itself, which lets you kind of create the future you want. But this future at DK is exactly what I was looking for.
That's awesome. And so one of the things that I loved going from on staff to freelancing was that I had total control over my work. Well, at least in theory. We all know it doesn't actually work that way, but total control over work-life balance. And especially if you're a freelancer that works remotely, you have a lot of leeway in terms of like the hours you work and how many days a week and things like that. Are you able to still have a pretty good work-life balance being back on staff at a big studio?
I'm trying to decide if this is my problem or this is the industry problem, but I just came off of like a 16-hour day yesterday of just like trying to jam on a deadline. I have found it way more true that freelance is way easier to kind of control those hours, because you walk in the door and you say you have a day rate, and then you tell them that you have a after 10 hours rate, and then you tell them you have a 1.5 or 2x weekend rate, and those things just kind of come down to numbers where you really know when someone needs you to pull a day like that because they're going to pay for it. Whereas, in staff, it's again, that team mentality where sometimes you have to pull together. Sometimes a job comes in on Monday and they need a pitch on Tuesday night. Sometimes you have a Friday delivery that gets pushed up to Wednesday. And there's no real way to say no to that. There are ways to push back, and there's ways to be creative about what you deliver. But in a staff position, I found more often than not that there's just times where you have to push and go forward. The nice benefit of that a lot of times is that if you hit the deadline, you hit the mark, you pass the test, you win the pitch, the next day, there's a wonderful thing called comp time that comes into fact that you never hear that, when you're a freelancer, like you either work or you don't, and you get paid when you do, and you don't get paid when you don't. So there's positive and negatives both, but I definitely feel like I work a lot more hours when I'm staff than when I'm freelance.
Yeah, I hear you. So, in addition to being on a great team and being part of Digital Kitchen, which of course for decades has done great work, are there other benefits of being full-time that were attracted to you? I mean, are they paying you really well? Are you getting, bonuses, better healthcare? Like, let's get into the weeds. Like, what has improved for you? I
think for me, the thing that I hated about freelance was the instability. I loved it when I was booked and I knew I was booked for the next month or two. But when I was getting down to the last week of a booking, I hated the having to go up and have the awkward conversation of, okay, I know you've got me on hold. I know this job looks like it's going to go for another month, but can you just book me for that month? Because we all know if we really push on it, we're going to all be here, right? But then you get I can only give you a 1 week extension. I can only give you another 1 week extension. And it just that instability, that lack of transparency, because you're not on the team, you don't get access to the kind of financial situation or the kind of organizational situation. Like you really felt like you were, even though you were the most required element on the job because it couldn't get done, you really feel a lot of times when you're freelance, at least I did, that you were the afterthought, like even to the point where speaking very openly about it, like even getting paid. I've had multiple situations where I would work for 6, 8, 10, 12 weeks for a company. And then I'm supposed to be getting paid net 30 and it turns into net 60. And then it turns into net 90. And then it turns into talking to lawyers. And then it turns into talking about threatening not to come in when there's a deadline. Like that kind of stuff doesn't happen when you're staff. It doesn't happen. And even the best of companies, even with the best of intentions, I found it happened with alarming frequency, no matter what I did, no matter if I put in kill fees, no matter if I put in, 2x multipliers on overtime, the amount of abuse because of mismanagement or because of lack of knowledge that happens when you're a freelancer it wore me down. It's definitely a grind that it's not every place, but it happened too often for me not to say it's endemic to the industry.
Gotcha. I mean, it's all true. And it's, I really harp on freelancing like all the time. I wrote a book about freelancing because I feel so strongly about it. However, there is a downside to it. There's a balance to everything, and with the good comes the bad. So I'm glad you're saying this stuff because it's really like good for freelancers to know this, people thinking of going into freelancing. So let's talk about another huge transition, which is not just freelance to full time, but it's LA to Chicago. I've spent a little bit of time in each city, but even just spending a few days there, you can tell they're very different cities. So, and I know Digital Kitchen has an LA office, right? So why didn't you just stay in LA? Was there some other reason you wanted to come back to Chicago?
I mean, my whole plan in life is always to come back to Chicago. Partially, I have amazing family here. I have amazing history. I'm wearing the shirt right now, but I'm a huge Chicago Blackhawks fan, and we're going into our first game of the playoffs tonight. I could go to hockey games with a team that I actually enjoy cheering for instead of the Kings, who I hate. So there's lots of little things, but the biggest thing, honestly, is that when I left Chicago, I really wanted to get into motion graphics. And I've said this to Nick Campbell before. I went to one of the Chicago motion graphics meetups, I think like 3 months before I actually left Chicago, and there were 9 people there. And then I think last year I came back and I went to Half Res, and there were probably 500 or 600 people. There was a stage with people like Mike the Monkey was doing live tutorials. There was beer. It was a party. And I literally was like, I can come back to Chicago because the industry is there now. The culture is there. The excitement, the heat, the body of freelancers that I want to work with are there. Swarovski is here. Leviathan is here. There's companies that have matured so much in, I think it's been 6.5, 7 years in Chicago, that it is not LA. I tell people all the time, there's probably 3 companies I desperately want to work for in Chicago. When I was working at Royale in Larchmont, there were 3 companies on the block I wanted to work for. So it's nowhere near comparable in terms of the amount of work or the amount of people or the amount of jobs, but it's changed dramatically. And then selfishly, in Chicago, there is, I don't know if I should be saying it out loud, there is an incredible talent pool of 2D hand-drawn animators that are sitting just under the surface that the motion graphics industry has never taken advantage of, because 2D has always been kind of this unicorn kind of galloping off on the side that, only a couple companies have kind of really taken to heart. But one of my main goals coming into Digital Kitchen Chicago is to get us using some of that talent that I know is there, that is just desperate to be kind of given a spotlight on a couple of the right jobs, and then it can explode, at least here in the city.
That's really cool to hear that Chicago has had such an explosion in their motion design scene. I worked in Boston, and when, from the time I started freelancing to the time I left the company that I had started, I think Boston was just about to get there. It still doesn't sound anywhere close to what Chicago has. And my biggest challenge when I was a creative director running a studio was finding good talent. It was
always. Yeah, it's the hardest thing.
So hard to scale up as a new company. You can't just hire a big staff. You have to rely on freelancers, and we couldn't find any. So I was going to ask you about that, because in LA, I imagine it can't be that hard to find a good After Effects artist. But how hard is it in Chicago?
You know what? As much as I believe that, and as much as I'd like to think that, it's still difficult in LA, because it's all timing. It's finding the right After Effects person for the specific job you have, for the rate that you need them, for the time that you need them for. It's still difficult. Like, I would say After Effects maybe not as bad. Anything VFX, it's a little bit easier. There's more, nuke guys, and there's more matte painters and high-end texture map developers. Like, that stuff there, it still exists because there's people on, like commercial runs, and then they'll have 2 weeks off, or they're on a feature for 9 months and they get 2 months off to the next feature. You can find that. But honestly, the thing I tell people all the time is, if you want to work in our industry, I wouldn't even say go to school. I would say become an incredible Cinema 4D artist, develop a design sensibility, understand type, understand color, understand layout, and get to LA and start networking, because the amount of jobs that I cannot find a reliable, dependable, not even like, I hate this term, but rock star motion graphics guy, but just someone to get in, start throwing down keyframes, to start modeling, to start playing with cloners. Cinema 4D is still so difficult, even in Los Angeles, to find. Chicago, there is a huge amount of what I would call middleweight Cinema 4D artists. Like, they're not juniors. They're not associates. They're not interns. They know their way around MoGraph. They know their way around, keyframing. They probably know a third-party render engine like Octane or Redshift or something like that. But I would say there's not a lot of heavyweight C4D people in terms of really knowing the intricacies, knowing Espresso, knowing how to unwrap. For some reason, no one knows how to unwrap textures in the motion graphics industry. It's still like a very difficult skill to find. I also find that there's a lot of people who know After Effects in terms of Trapcode Particular and setting up type, but there's not a lot of people who can take a raw image and spit out passes and composite something that looks filmic. It's one of the things that I am so stoked that someone like Chad Ashley is at Grayscale Gorilla, because that guy knows his way inside and out of compositing to make something look filmic. And that pool of people that watch Grayscale Gorilla tutorials or go to School of Motion, they're desperate to take that like next level up in terms of their taste and their eye, and they don't know how. And someone like Chad is a really, really incredible asset just to the motion graphics industry at large to kind of push everybody forward. So that's what I kind of find. It's still difficult in LA. It's really difficult here to find people like with a very specific, like try to find a real flow artist that isn't working at one of the 3 VFX shops or a Houdini person is really difficult in Chicago. But the industry is there, the people are there, and we need to help everybody kind of move in lockstep up to the next level, if that makes any sense.
That was an amazing rant. I was just nodding my head the entire time, man. And it's funny too, because you said there's not heavyweight C4D artists. And so I guess the way that I would kind of interpret that is there's enough people that know the software, and if you tell them do this, they can kind of do it. But that's like the surface. Yep. Especially if you're working at a place like DK, you're telling a story with the image you're creating, and you need to understand 3 or 4 levels deeper than just how to use X particles to make some emitter do something. You need to know why, and maybe like we should have some particles over here because that's going to balance the composition. I mean, there's like so many layers to it. And at Toil, when I was running Toil in Boston, we would find After Effects artists who knew After Effects inside and out. And this is actually the biggest problem, was they were booked constantly doing really, really poor work just because clients, at least in Boston, and most of the clients that you could freelance for, weren't sophisticated enough to push back and say, right, I'm not going to pay you $500 a day to turn this in. Just because you know the software doesn't mean you're good at using it. And so I always push, like, forget the software for a second. Learn some animation principles. Learn some design principles. If you're talking about 3D, learn some cinematography principles. Learn where lights go, and learn about framing and why you'd use different lenses. And that's the stuff I think that makes people a heavyweight.
Absolutely. Well, honestly, that's why I took your design boot camp, not to be a salesman standing on top of the box right now.
Thank you for saying that.
But that's honestly why I took the design boot camp, because I went to school for 2 years here in Chicago at possibly the worst school you could go to learn 3D animation, and I learned button pushing. And I always knew that was going to be the thing that held me back. And I felt it when I was at Imaginary Forces. I was working with people who went to SCAD, who went to Art Center, who went to all these amazing schools, and I didn't have those bona fides. Whether or not I could do the design or not, I didn't even have that reputation yet with the owners and the EP and the head of production. And I knew I had to hustle to build up that skill set. So even now as a professional, I think I was in the beta of the first design boot camp, and that was amazing just to kind of fortify, like, okay, I think these are the principles. I've gotten to a point where I have like an instinct, but they're not formalized as like, this is what the rule of thirds are. This is why you kern things. This is why you have, grids that you design off of. I had internalized them from, a long time of being around the work and kind of like taking apart. I would go and take people's style frames at Imaginary Forces and stay late and turn all the layers off in Photoshop and one by one turn them on, thinking that there was like magic in between the layers that I could just like through osmosis. And over time doing that enough, you do have like an internalized sense of it. But I needed that formal kind of like someone that just ground into me. This is why you kern things. This is what bad kerning looks like. This is what, the correct use of space and value contrast and texture contrast, like all those kind of like core fundamentals. I think it gets back to what I see in Chicago a lot, is that for some reason there's this barricade between, I see amazing artists like illustrators and storyboard artists and people who pitch, and there's a complete aversion to technology. Or I see people who are great at the technology, like amazing at the technology, learning new renderers, sitting and watching every tutorial that comes up, tweaking out one-a-days that look like everybody else's one-a-days. But the artistry, there's a block there somewhere. And I haven't figured it out other than when I left Chicago, one of the other big reasons I left was that I had a really good job. I was making decent money working on slot machines in Chicago, but I could feel the slowly creeping feeling of security settling in, and my kind of hunger and drive was getting slower because I was comfortable. And I had great examples of people that were 5 to 10 years older than me that had kind of calcified, and it scared the living daylights out of me because I knew the industry changes every 2 to 3 years, and these people had stopped. They weren't artists anymore. They were just people pressing buttons. And I knew I needed to be around other people that would challenge me and other people who were talking about this every day. When we went to lunch, we were talking about Nuke and we were talking about the new render engine. And Arnold 5 just came out yesterday. Can you believe it does this? And it's got a new hair render. And that wasn't happening around me in Chicago. So I kind of feel like that might be a little bit of why I'm working on a job right now and I've got 3-4 amazing C4D heavyweights that we can talk about that stuff, but I don't see a lot of that yet. And I feel like that kind of like drive for safety and security still kind of exists in some towns, in some cities, in some parts of the MoGraph industry where they're not being pushed. What I love is meeting somebody who's super ambitious. When I teach at MoGraph Mentor, or I have somebody who sends me their reel online and they're a junior artist or they're in school, and I see them pushing way beyond their capabilities, way beyond their bounds, that's the stuff that I want to hire that person right away, even if I can't use them on a job right now, because I know that they're going to push me, they're going to push the rest of the people I work with, and given the right amount of time to kind of pressure cook them with tutorials and kind of honing their art skills, that person is always going to be pushing the rest of their lives.
That's really great. And now that's part of your job as creative director, is to kind of cultivate young talent, push them, get them to do things they didn't think they were capable of. So can you describe, like, what does a day in the life of a creative director look like? What do you do when you get to work?
It's this is one thing I love talking about to people, because everybody, especially when I was in LA, especially for some reason, kids coming out of Art Center, just saying it out loud, they all thought they were already art directors or creative directors, and nobody had just given them the title yet. And the thing that's really, I don't know if you've felt this before, but in this industry, I feel like it's really crazy because you spend 4, 5, 6 years getting really good at something creative. And then right when you're at the apex of being like, I understand it, I feel like I have mastery of it, I'm ready to take the next step. Whoever is that's above you that's going to make that decision says, that's great, we really like you. Now you need to do something you've never done before and almost completely stop doing that thing you've done for the last 6 years. Right. To me, that's what the creative directing ends up being, is that none of us went to school for therapy. None of us went to school to be to go to school for bargaining or for the art of compromise. No one went to school for negotiation. No one went to the school for running Gantt charts or scheduling. But those are all the things that you end up doing as a creative director that everybody thinks is going to be awesome because you get to make all the decisions. And then it really turns into, when I worked with Guillermo del Toro, he told me one time, he's like, if you want to direct, he's like, you got to learn how to say no, like 99% of the time, and then find the 1% of saying yes, that's the right decision. And that honestly feels like that's almost all of what I do as a creative director. I'm still lucky at DK that I get to be on the box, but that's me fighting to be on the box most of the time. It's like, I got to animate at least one shot in every job. I've got to at least try to go into After Effects and comp a shot. But most of it is meetings, phone calls, looking at demo reels, traveling out to a client to convince them that what we're doing is the right decision. It's that stuff that you don't think of when you're in school, when you're like, oh yeah, I'm going to be a creative director. This is going to be awesome. I'm going to get paid well, do whatever I want. There's a lot of not very sexy stuff with being a creative director.
I had the same experience, and I want to dig into a bunch of those things. So let's talk about what Guillermo del Toro, which is a very sweet name drop to be able to do, man. Props. Props for that. So, he's right. You have to say no 99 times for the one yes. And that's really hard for some people. It was very hard for me to tell someone who had just spent all day working on something that it wasn't even close to what we needed. And we still needed it to be good, and we needed it tomorrow. That was always very hard for me. So I'm wondering if that's hard for you. And have you learned any ways to kind of, when you have to say that to somebody, to do it in a way that doesn't destroy them or destroy you?
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff to unpack. We could talk about this for one whole show, but there's a lot of stuff to unpack with that. I think one thing, it's a cheap and easy thing, but I think it's it's served me very well, is to always find something positive that someone's worked on. You don't always have to lead with this, but it's always good to end with it, is that someone's put in a lot of work and they've always put in their work with the best, if they've been communicated to correctly, they've worked with the best intentions, right? They're not working saying, I'm going to do the opposite of what this guy said because I'm going to wow him. Most people professionally aren't like that. So they've gone with the best intentions. So there's something there that if it's 100% off, that means I did a really bad job communicating the idea. So I'm not even criticizing that person. I'm criticizing myself, or I should be. So I try to find something that we can keep, or something that is positive whenever I interact with someone. When I'm looking at a crit or trying to look at a whole piece together, find something that we can kind of build off of. So I try to do that, but I try to very honestly and very quickly not beat around what's not working. I think what helps with that, and it's actually kind of in our ethos here at DK, is that we try to make things as real and as tangible as fast as possible. I think it's good to theorize, and it's good to get people in a room and talk, and it's good to have one person set a direction. But the longer you stay in the kind of like ethereal, ephemeral land of, in capital letters, ideas that I hate, the faster you can get and just write some words down on a board and say, hey, these are the things this job is not. It is not going to be funny. It is not going to be sophomoric. It is going to be austere, and it is going to be serious, and it's going to create wonder, right? Those 3 words are what we're doing, and these 3 words are what we are not doing. That helps me a lot, when I get to tell someone, hey, this isn't working, because we can go back to that board and be like, hey, remember how I said it's got to be austere? It has to feel, like there's a sense of wonder. This is what I mean by it, because this is not doing it. I try to do that, like get to tangible as fast as possible. So if it means going to cinema, literally do 20 frame grabs, just literally like wireframe, gray box, screen capture. Don't even render, just screen capture and throw it in a timeline and get an edit going as fast and as sloppy as possible. Something that you can actually start making points of reference, then guided by those kinds of ideas that we all agreed on at the beginning. That helps me a lot, because then I can say it's not my ego as a director saying, oh, you did it wrong, I wouldn't have done that, because no one ever responds to that. We can say as a team, we agreed on this concept and we agreed on these things, and they're not marching towards that. That helps me quite a bit. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Well, it does in a way, because I think that scenario is someone just, missing the mark, in terms of tone or maybe the way it makes you feel. But I'm thinking of like, I don't know, every freelancer's worst nightmare, where you give them a board so they don't have to like design anything, and you say, this is let's pretend it's end tag for a commercial you guys are doing. And it literally, you just need to animate the logo on in some cool way, animate the type in, and they just don't do a good job at it. They, that you realize, and I mean, you might even blame yourself. Maybe I shouldn't have hired this person, but like the animation isn't good. There's no finesse to it. There's the eases are just like the default easy ease. Yes. Like in that situation, that you're going to have to give this person some bad news. And those are the situations. And it could have just been, I mean, I don't know. And now I'm filled with self-doubt. Like maybe I was just maybe I hired too quickly. Like I was too easy to hire these freelancers. But that happened to me a few times, and it was really awkward. And then I'd do it, I'd get it out there, and then I'd go home and I'd drink a bunch of beer.
So how did you handle it though in the end? Did you replace the person, or, because for me, it really depends on how much room you have to pull the parachute. Like if it's a case of, oh, we have this has to get done tomorrow, I can't teach this person why it was wrong, I need to just do it. Inevitably, I end up going on the box and doing a part of it myself. If there's still some time to pull the parachute, like let's say what your scenario is, right? Like there's 3 shots to this end tag or 3 shots to this piece. I will pick the one that I think I can as quickly as possible show what I'm looking for. And I will try to at least do that, whether the person's over my shoulder. I'll be like, hey, in an hour, I'm going to just rough this out, and then I want you to take it to finish, or I want you to do the other 2 shots like this. The worst thing I think you can do is rip a job out of someone's hands if they're still going to be employed by you, if you're still going to call on them. If you have to, I mean, the worst case scenario is having to dismiss someone and bring someone else in, which happens. It becomes kind of like a radar sense that you have as a creative director, where you and your producer typically, when you're kind of stepping out on the edge and saying like, this might screw up, but I really want to give this person a chance. And then you kind of have the ticking clock in the back of your head saying, okay, every day we got to check in with this guy. If you have someone who you're fully confident in and you go for 4 days and you come back on the 5th day and it's totally, wrong, I don't know. Have you run into that situation? Because that's the one that is the hardest, where you're like, oh man, I got to scramble. I got to put this person on something else or let them go.
The situation, I mean, there's been kind of both kinds. I mean, most of the time, what I try to do in that situation is teach. I mean, that's kind of the point in my career where I discovered I really, really like teaching, because then, not only am I going to help the job get done and I'm not going to have to do it, I just have to kind of spend an hour showing them stuff. But I'm also creating a loyal freelancer, which exactly. I mean, there's a lot of value to that as a studio, to have freelancers like working with you. They're growing as they're helping you. But there have been situations where we needed someone, and it's Boston, and there's just not a lot of freelancers. And so you book the one that's available, and you think in your head, like, I'm asking them to do something very simple. This shouldn't be an issue. And then you come back 3-4 hours later and you say, hey, show me what you've done. And they haven't done anything yet because they're still trying to find the tutorial to teach. Mm-hmm. And in that situation, I've actually had to literally kick them off the box and just do it, and then have a talk with them afterwards and lower their rate. And I've been in some very uncomfortable situations like that. And the reason I bring it up is because at the time that I had to have that conversation, I did not think of myself as someone who was capable of being that much. I mean, that's a very grown-up thing to have to do, and it was very uncomfortable. And I didn't think that I'd ever have to do that, or I definitely didn't want to. But yet, I was able to, and it helped me grow. I'm curious, do you think that being a creative director is something anyone can grow into, or are there certain types of people that really should just stick to sitting behind the box and doing their thing?
I think there's a lot of people who think that's what they want to do because they have a misguided sense of what the job is. And then when they get there, those people either stick around and become really bad creative directors, or I've had really good friends who are amazing animators that have been kind of forced into becoming creative directors. And 6 months in, they step back and are like, look, I'm better value being an animator. I think there are people who are not creative directors. And I tend to find that actually when there's people who are incredibly talented at a very specific thing. Like if you're an amazing character animator, but you're not a good communicator, or you're not open to different types of workflows to understand that each person is really, really different, and you have to kind of fashion the way you talk to people based on who they are. That's why I said, like, we never got trained to be therapists, right?
Right.
Like, to get what you need from each person, you need to have a different interaction style with almost every single person. Because if you're just the tough kind of like junior high school football coach to everybody, and you just create great things out of constant pressure and conflict, you may have half a studio that won't react to that, and you'll lose them. Some people might, really love it because they get pushed and they like that sense of being pushed. But I think if you're not a great communicator and you're not a great problem solver, not in the like super micro, like Cinema 4D way of problem solving, but in a macro, like looking at the big picture, I don't think that creative directing is for you, because you're going to get frustrated really fast, or you're going to do the worst thing possible and be like, here, give me that. The worst thing a creative director can do, and you see the jokes all the time of like hovering art director names of videos. The worst thing you can do as a creative director is say, here, give me that. Because I think the best lesson I can give anybody, and I've kind of learned it by stumbling and screwing up a lot, is that if you want to be a creative director, or you're in the position where you're being forced to be a creative director, the number one word you can remember is partner. Like, you really are building partnerships with a lot of different people. Everybody has this kind of auteur theory, George Lucas, I'm the guy making every decision and I run it and it's mine. And when it's done, my name's on the the billboard that says I did this. In our world, no one ever cares unless you're Patrick Clare. But
he's earned it though.
and Patrick Clare has spent 10 years getting to the point where he's now Patrick Clare to be able to do that. So it's not an overnight thing, but to be honest, it's all partnerships. Like you said, you don't want to just tell someone that what they're doing wrong and then burn that bridge and never have them come back, or build the reputation that you're, an asshole to work with, because that's not going to help you. But I also think that there's a lot of pressure when you're a new director, whether it's an art director, creative director, anything, that you have to wear the weight of the world on your shoulders, and you have to have every single answer, and you have to know every single tool, and you have to know how to answer every single problem with the client immediately. Like, that's not the job. The job is being able to find the right person to help you do each thing at the right time. So yeah, if you're not a good people person, I don't think being a creative director is the thing for you.
That makes a ton of sense. And let me ask you about this part too, because it's probably different from company to company, but I think the stereotype of creative director, and actually some of the ones that I've worked with that weren't as good, I would say, at their job, is that they've got the artistic side down. They can lead the creative, but then there's kind of the, I guess, almost the producer side of being a creative director, assembling the right team and managing expectations and talking to client and doing pitches and stuff like that. So how was the transition into that role for you? What has that taught you?
I've really enjoyed it. I mean, the thing that I love about motion graphics is that it's really just an umbrella term for all the stuff I would be doing otherwise, all the stuff I love. You know, like I'm not a musician, but I love music. I love photography. I have a weird fascination with type. I obviously love animation, whether it's character or moving a square to create an emotion, whatever that might be. I love all that stuff, so I feel like it kind of comes naturally because I really appreciate every kind of part of it. I also kind of really love the producing side, the like figuring out all the different things that have dependencies with each other. So I really like working with a good producer. I get almost thermonuclear mad when I'm working with a bad producer who doesn't appreciate that kind of like the delicacy of a job. Like you need to set it up just right, and you need to make sure that there's, you know, like the waterfall of we just got an RFP to we just shipped a job is very delicate. It has a lot of like dependencies and bottlenecks. And I've run into producers who just love like nerding out about that kind of like intricacy to make sure the job runs smoothly. And I've run into other producers like, hey, that's your job. That's not my job. Good luck. And that part I think I've really struggled with is like finding the right producers to have the right relationships with that act as partners. That's probably been the hardest thing for me is like, I love clients. I love talking to clients. The problem solving there is great. And the payoff when a client really clicks and you solve a problem that they didn't even know they have, that's how you become someone like Kyle Cooper. Like Kyle is incredibly great at discovering the truth to something that even a director who spent his last 3 years working on something, Kyle can find a way to discover that to the point where the director will pay them crazy amounts of money and will come back to them over and over because they do something that they couldn't even do. That part is awesome. That's so much fun when you creatively like link together and you realize you solved something as a team. So again, I don't know if that answers it, but I think the producing side of it's been really difficult for me because I can kind of see a lot of what I think needs to be done and it doesn't get done, or it's not as like tight and organized as the production side, like the actual execution side needs it to be. The client side's great. Teaching like new people is awesome. I love finding talent. That's really good. And then I've actually been more and more excited about the business side of it. That was one thing that when I was at Imaginary Forces, I struggled with a lot. And then being at a lot of different shops in a short amount of time to see how different people kind of set their companies up and organize them and create hierarchies, that's been fascinating to me. So yeah, I on the creative directing side, I've really liked all that. Like, I don't think we talked about Cinema 4D at all on that. Like those other things have been really fun to see.
Yeah, I mean, and that's, I think, kind of the goal. If you are a creative director, you know, you're still a MoGraph artist. You still want to like get on the box, but that's not the best use of your time, especially from DK's point of view. If you have the title and salary of creative director. Yeah. So let's talk about the clients. You just talked about, you said a few times, you really love working with clients. So, you know, at the beginning of a project, a lot of times there's a pitch phase. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on the way that seems to work. We actually had a producer on the podcast a while ago from the Mill. Previously, actually worked at Digital Kitchen, Erica Hilbert, and she said that the Mill pitches a lot, and they actually don't have a problem with it. But I've heard other people from other studios say, you know, it's a horrible model. We're doing work for free. It cheapens everything. I'm curious what your take on it is, and how does DK deal with that? How do you decide, like, okay, we can put a month of resources into this with maybe zero payout? Like, how do those decisions get made?
I think I was really lucky being at Imaginary Forces because I maybe was a little bit on the tail end of it, but I got to see the almost like the whole history of how pitching was done, how it is now, and where it's going in the future. So when I was there, I still heard all the kind of like people lamenting the fact that they had to pitch. You know, like when Kyle was there, or even when Kyle Cooper left, and there were all of his kind of acolytes, there was a moment where Imaginary Forces would get paid just to pitch, just to have the right to be attached to the cool of that company at its inception. They were getting paid tens of thousands of dollars to be like, all right, cool. If you want us to do this, we're not going to put pen to paper until we get X. And then it went to, okay, now there's like UCO, there's a couple other companies. We have a little bit of competition, but you know, there's directors who come to us because of the relationship. We're not going to do it for free, but we may not get a fee up front. And then it turned into, now 10 years into it, 15 years into it, there's 100 companies in the country that can do this. And we have to prove to people why our vision, and that's an important word, our vision is worth the money we're going to get paid versus someone else's vision. And then probably like the last year that I was there, it really turned into motion graphics in most positions are a commodity, and people are literally ordering off of a menu of what they want, and they'll tell you what they'll pay for it. And you need to spend like $5,000 to $10,000 to fight against all the other people that want to get that little nibble as well. So I've seen the whole spectrum. And it's very frustrating. I used to be in visual effects, and I have a lot of friends in visual effects, and I've seen that entire industry basically implode from the inside out. And the biggest problem in that whole industry was when ILM, which was Industrial Light and Magic, focused more on the industry and less on the magic, when everything was about computers and render times and software and less about the Hal Hickles and the John Knowles and the true artists. That whole industry kind of imploded for a multitude of other reasons. But to me, that was the biggest thing. I feel like motion graphics is a little bit safeguarded on that because we have more than 6 clients. But the pitching process is frightening. If you ever listen to Chris Do, he basically doomsdays the apocalypse of the industry and tells everybody to get out. But he's at the front lines of a company that's been open for 15 years that has institutionalized overhead and big budgets and salaries, and I'm sure, real estate issues, all kinds of huge big budget issues, but they have all the legacy of old machines and old software. For those giant companies like us, DK, IF, a company like Blind, pitching is really difficult to kind of say, yeah, we're going to spend $10,000 on a $100,000 job, because it really eats into if you can even make money on the job. Like companies our size actually turn away a lot of decent jobs because the budgets just don't make sense. And that includes, from day one when we're asked to pitch. But the good thing about that, I think, is that there are a lot of smaller companies that are a lot more lean, that have a lot more modern methodologies, that don't have as many people. They can go ahead and afford to spend $2,000 because if they get a $100,000 job, that's huge for them. So I feel like it's part of the natural kind of cycle of this industry. The only problem is we're going through the first cycle, right? Like a company like UCO or DK or IF or Blind, like they're all kind of going through this, like we're about 10, 15, 20 years old. They're on the back end of that cycle. And there's a bunch of companies starting up that are kind of sometimes eating our lunch because they're small and they're agile and their budgets aren't, their overhead's not as expensive. I think it's part of the natural cycle. I think that we're never going to get to the point where we get like $20,000 pitch fees to do a job. But I do think that there's a way to kind of course correct as well. That's kind of my take on the business side of it.
I am really glad you brought up Chris Do, because as you were talking, you kind of referenced the thing he said that kind of set off a firestorm about, I think what he was talking about.
Are we going to say the word? Are we going to say
I wrote down bricklayer. I did write it down. I wrote it down. Yeah. And so what I wrote down was bricklayer versus visionary, because you also said the word vision, right? Mm-hmm. And I think you're right. I think that there are companies out there, I won't name them, but like there are companies out there that unapologetically will make you a factory perfect explainer video. Right. And it's and literally like there's a formula and they'll make it and it's $5,000. Yep. And, DK can never do that. Neither can Blind. I mean, right. So we had Chris Do on the podcast and he talked about Blind did an experiment where they tried to spin off kind of a separate wing of the company that just did explainer videos. And they had trouble getting people even to take them seriously because they'd look at their other work and be like, you guys should not be doing explainer videos, even if there was a way they could do it profitably. It's really interesting. And DK is an interesting example because DK underwent like what appeared from the outside to be a pretty radical change. I don't know, it was probably 10 years ago at this point, where they started branding themselves as an agency. And I'm assuming that was kind of in response to seeing down the road, right. Oh, motion graphics is becoming a commodity. We need to be able to do more than that. Is that kind of what it's like on the inside?
I mean, I can't speak to that agency decision because I wasn't here when that happened. But what I can say is that I've seen it a lot of places is that when companies like DK or Imaginary Forces or Royale or any of those companies start talking about maybe we should become an agency, what I really truly believe they're saying is we want to be direct to client. Yeah. We want to have a relationship with Nike. We want to have a relationship with Apple. We don't want to go through Chiat or 72 and Sunny or all these other middlemen that are reminiscent of the record industry. with the record companies kind of being between the artist and the consumer, they're really saying, hey, is there a way for us to kind of cut that out so we could just work directly with you? Because it'd be a lot easier. You can talk directly to the people who are making the stuff, and we'll do it cheaper, but maybe we can get some reoccurring work all the time as well. I really think that's what people are saying when they say agency. When a company like ours or another company our size says we want to be an agency, it doesn't mean we want to do ad buys. It doesn't mean we're going to have a 50-person strategy branding team in the back. It doesn't mean that we're going to have 100 account reps. It means that we really are like, oh man, instead of having to work through 3 people to get our hands and our voices seen and heard by the client, can we just talk to the client? They're right across the hall. There's just an office in between us. Can we just be in the office right next to you? I think that's what it means for the most part when people say that. I understand completely where Chris Do is coming from on some of the stuff. I disagree with the brick lane comment, and I think it probably got a little turned out of control, but Chris also tends to be hyperbolic when he's got to focus on him because he's trying to get people's attention to the situation he's going through as well. So I do understand that as well. Like there is a certain amount for a company like his. The biggest thing with someone like Chris or Peter Frankfurt or someone who's owned and been in a company for 15 to 20 years is that they don't have a perspective that you and I have. Or better said, we don't have their perspective, to be completely honest. Like Chris is looking at from what the business was from the beginning of the business when there were only 5 other people like him doing it. We can't lament the fact that the industry is no longer like that because it would never be that way. It would be like being in the Rolling Stones and being upset that there's 100 bands that sound like the Rolling Stones 50 years later. Like, of course there's going to be, right? Like that's going to happen. But you don't hear Mick Jagger complaining about, oh, there's all these people eating our lunch. He still goes out on the road and he tours. There's always going to be a market for our stuff. But I also think that there are companies where there are people and there are institutions and there are workflows that haven't been updated in 15 years. That haven't changed, that are getting paid the way they were when the money was so great because there were only 5 other places to go for that. Like companies have to evolve. They have to change. Sometimes, unfortunately, they have to restructure. The natural order of things at Imaginary Forces always seem to be someone would be there, someone would become a creative director, 2, 3, 4, 5 years go by, they leave and they start their own company. You & Co, I believe, was like that. I know Alma Mater is like that. My very first art director, creative director, Brian Ma, left probably the first 6 months I was there and started a successful company. That's the natural order of things. But if a company just keeps on building up this pressure of, internalized overheads, old hardware, old techniques, and the same people working there making more and more money, that I can understand where Chris is like, the sky's falling, the world's crumbling. This is going to all change. At the same time, though, I'm not charging people $300 for a PDF and how to pitch. So that's where I get a little kind of, my eyebrow gets raised when I hear people doomsdaying at the same time, then kind of selling you how to keep the industry going. The
gauntlet has been thrown down. You should go on Chris's podcast. I'm sure he'd love to talk about that.
Chris and I are friends. We've talked a lot. I respect Chris a lot. I think again the bricklayer thing lit me on fire. I probably had a 20 tweet kind of storm about this is ridiculous and how dare you, and the people that you work for are the people you're talking about. And in the end, if you're trying to get attention, then he did what he was hoping to do. And if it was to get attention to the problem, then I'm assuming that was his intent. Then good on him for doing that. I disagree, but I'd rather have the conversation continuing about it than just be like, oh, screw that. He doesn't know what he's talking about.
The 3 of us are going to have a good time at NAB this year. I will say that.
Yes,
so, okay.
definitely.
So Ryan, so you talked a little bit about, when and it's pretty, I think you're right. When a company says we're becoming an agency, they mean we're cutting out the middleman. Mm-hmm. And that middleman oftentimes is an ad agency. And ad agencies have kind of responded by building their own in-house, motion design studios. So I'm curious, now what percentage of the work that you guys are doing is direct to client? And do you prefer to do it that way? Or do you still like to work with ad agencies? Is there still some reason that an ad agency should maybe be in the middle sometimes?
If it was 72 and Sony, I'd love to work with an ad agency. I've worked on a couple jobs with specific people. It's just like what I was saying before. I want to work with the best people possible that have the client's intentions in mind, not their own ego, not their bottom line. Because if you line up with the client and it's a client that you've vetted and the budgets work for you, in the end, the stars align most of the time. I think I just was tweeting last night about how much during MoChat. Do you take part in MoChat on Twitter at all?
Well, I have 3 kids, so no, but like I'm aware of it. And every once in a while I'll try to like poke my head in if I get mentioned or something. Yeah.
There was a great discussion, I think it was 2 nights ago, about like this topic, about what's it like working with an agency versus working direct to client. And I honestly, if you're asking me as a freelancer, what would I like? I'd love to work with agencies, because the agencies get the hot jobs. The agencies are the ones who have the huge multi-million-dollar ads buys with the ability to go and, like put an Apple commercial on every screen you've seen all at once, right? Like they have the ability to do that. If you want to be on a hot job for a really cool client and see your work on every screen possible, like on billboards, on buses and elevators, on your phone, on every screen, as a freelancer, I want to work with an agency because they have the keys still. As a business owner or someone working at a higher level at a shop, I desperately want direct to client. I want to be directly with the guy who's going to tell me what he wants, who's going to hand me the check, and that I can have the opportunity to have their arm put around my shoulder and pulled close. So I'm part of the next conversation before the next product even launches. Like I desperately want that kind of like trusted partnership, because it creates stability, it creates security, it becomes reliable income, becomes reliable jobs. The more reliable jobs you have like that, then the more you have the ability to go and do like a loss leader or an experiment or a, God forbid, your own product or your own project. Those create the ability to kind of extend beyond just being a motion graphic shop. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I think it really, the answer to that question depends on your perspective.
Yeah, it does make sense though, because I think that when you work direct with a client as a company, typically your incentives are probably closer aligned than if there's the agency in the middle whose business model is actually ad buying, and then the creative is just kind of the cherry on top, which is kind of the dirty little secret of the advertising industry.
I think that's the word that's the exact word I use, is that until you've done it a bunch of times, you don't realize how much of a bother the actual ad is for the ad agency. And it literally is that. It's a very, very tiny cherry on top that some people in the company don't even like the taste of that cherry. Like a lot of people are just like, oh, do we even have to bother with this ad? Just make somebody make it so I can get it on a bunch of screens and get paid for it. And that's frustrating, because it really feels like, even if we did a job for Twitter when we were at Royale, and we literally the agency had a 24/7 presence in our boardroom because we were offering the company like 24-hour turnarounds at all times. And the ad ended up being a little, I don't know how it ended up, but it wasn't the most exciting experience, and it wasn't the most exciting commercial. It wasn't the most exciting reaction. And I think for everybody, it was just like, how did this happen? And it felt like the focus was never on the ad itself. The focus was like, what are we going to do with the ad afterwards? Where are we going to put it? And that's where, if I'm working directly with the client, I feel like you said, the incentive to do well and to be on point with the messaging, everybody's aligned because the goals are the same, right? Like if we do a great job on this one, we're going to get another one. Whereas with the agency, we might have just gotten picked because our creative was kind of all right, and the timing worked out, and the budget worked out, and they need to go. And there's so much more that you don't see when you're working with an agency than if you're just direct to client. That said, though, if you are direct to client, sometimes it means you are almost disqualified from those super awesome jobs. Like if you're working direct to client with a shoe company, you may not get the badass man versus machine, super Houdini'd, super tight macro, like stuff knitting together. You might be doing their show packages for a convention or for their store, the on-screen stuff, but it's reliable and it's consistent and you have a relationship. So yeah, it really depends on where you're coming from.
Awesome. All right. So we're going to close out this interview with 2 questions kind of related. So you've talked about your journey and you've gone from on staff, learning the ropes, climbing up the ranks, freelance. Now you're kind of at the top of the food chain at a very well-known, awesome studio. And throughout your career, you've kind of driven in a direction that aligned with your goals creatively and personally. So do you think, 10 years ahead, like where do you want to be? Where's the end game for Ryan Summers?
Oh, I have secret plans that I can't tell you.
Fair enough.
No, but in a perfect world, I tell this all the time, and it's what I love about you, Joey. It's what I love about Nick. Some photographers that I know. I really want to see not just myself, but more of us in the industry go from making the product to becoming the product, whatever that means for you. Like if it means that you're an inspirational YouTube, video guy that teaches people things or gets people inspired. I want to see more and more people do that, whether it means you go off to the side and you make your own videos and you make music videos, or you start directing shorts and you try to make a feature film. I hope that in the future, I get to find a balance between working for other people and working for myself. And then the third part of that kind of like triple play is that at the same time, I can take the experience that I've gained. And when I was in Chicago, people kept on telling me no, or I'm crazy, or that's impossible. I can do the opposite for other people, where I can be like, no, I can give you direct examples of what I did and other people I know to say, screw what everybody else says. You can do this. You may not have enough money to go to Art Center. You can work at Imaginary Forces. You may not have enough money to do a feature film. You can get on Kickstarter and get one going. Like, I want to be able to prove that, I'm from the south side of Chicago. I had no money and nobody ever even talked about art when I was in high school. And I'm working at the company that I wanted to work at 15 years ago, helping lead them, in new directions. So that's a big thing for me. If I can be in that position in 10 years from now, I'll be stoked.
Oh, you'll be there. I have no doubt, man. And that is a amazing goal. So then the last question is, what would you tell your 25-year-old self that, maybe, I don't know, this might be a bad question for you because you seem like you kind of had it all figured out and you you went in a nice straight line, but I'm sure you stumbled along the way. I'm sure there were times where you're like, I made a bad choice. What are some of the things you wish you knew back then that might have, I don't know, saved you, maybe would have kept some hair in your head or something?
I think it's easy for me. 10 years before I moved to LA, I had an opportunity coming out of school to go to Los Angeles. I would have told myself to do it immediately. Don't even think for a second not to go, not to try. There's a lot of fear, at least where I came from, of anything that's unknown or anything that feels like a gamble. The long play was always security and stability. I would have said, if you had an instinct to go. I don't have regrets, but I think the goals I have could be happening now instead of 10 years from now if I would have left Chicago and Illinois 10 years ago and do it. The other thing I would tell myself is that if you have a gut feeling about anything, follow it. Whether that's somebody telling you can't do something and you kind of feel like, I don't know, I think I can. Or it's, oh man, maybe I should try talking to this person, or maybe I should email this director that I love and ask if he needs help. I would tell myself, anytime you had one of those kind of like entrepreneurial, like aspirational instincts, go for it every single time.
Preach, brother. And I would say, where you said Los Angeles, insert New York City, London, Chicago, Boston. Like when you're young, that's probably the scariest time to make a move like that, but it's also the easiest time. It gets a lot harder as you age, especially if you do what I did and just go ahead and start a giant family.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Ryan, man, this was a killer conversation. Thank you so much. I mean, there's like so much wisdom you dropped, and I know everyone's going to get a ton out of it, and this will definitely not be the last time you come on this podcast.
Oh man, all I can ask is anybody who likes this, follow me on Twitter. And if you have any questions for anything, man, please hit me up. Please ask me. I'm more than happy to share anything. We got into some specifics, but I feel like we could always drill down even more. So reach out to me if you ever have a question.
Right on. And hopefully those t-shirts will be on sale on your website soon.
Yeah.
All right, man. We'll talk soon.
Cool. Thanks a lot.
You will definitely be hearing more from Ryan, and I suggest you go follow him on Twitter @Otternod. We'll link to it in the show notes. If you find someone like Ryan who really lives and breathes this stuff, follow them on social media, because you'll pick up a lot about the industry, what's new, what's going on, just by paying attention to what they're saying. And if you dug this interview, please, pretty please, go to iTunes, take 2 seconds, and rate and review the School of Motion podcast. It's a little awkward for me to have to ask, but it really does help us spread the good MoGraph word, and it enables us to keep booking incredible artists like Ryan. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you got inspired. I hope you learned a few networking tricks you might want to try. That's it for now. I'll catch you on the next one.